I cannot believe they brought Morbius back into theaters. Completely misread the memes, which is actually how I got tricked into pondering the Morbs. So I guess it's time to actually start covering superhero movies at this point, but that's neither here nor there. As a young boy struggles with his own sense of mortality in an attempt to save his new friend, he would discover that he actually had a talent for literally just being smart. 1000 IQ writing. Once discovered, this would lead him to attempt to discover the cure for both of them concerning their blood disease. However, in doing so, he would inadvertently change his own genetic makeup, making him reliant on others for sustenance. As time would go on, the edgiest of doctors would attempt to quell the bloodlust that he would develop, but not everyone around him would feel that the same methods were necessary for their own personal survival. In today's episode, we will discuss the actual plot of Morbs, what sort of disease he had that resulted in the drive to cure himself as well as the world, why this movie must have been super awkward to film for the actors, why Jared Leto has actually finally linked the DCU to the MCU or in association with the MCU in terms of the worst movies running through one guy, and ultimately, what were the effects of just cramming in new genetic material into your DNA with little to no thought of the process behind it. Oh yeah, it's gonna be one of those. Although I have to say, I mean, if you just turn off your brain and you don't think too much about it, it really is just dumb fun. So curveball time. There is no timestamp up on screen. The video is still set up the same way so all the OGs know where the sign starts, but I noticed on the analytics there is a drop off of a lot of people just actually watching the summaries, which is surprising to see, but you know, you might enjoy the science if you stay and watch. But then again, hey, you know, you like what you like. The science will always be included in these breakdowns though, so don't worry about that. But anyhow, let's get to when you have an extremely highly experimental cure, or really you think it's a cure, maybe conducting one lab test on one surviving mouse out of like 116 other bodied mice isn't really enough to go off of. I don't know. Should have thought about that one a little bit more, Morbius. So we start off our story with this being Sony and a new movie indicating that your boy is totally screwed on copyright. Also, again, this is in association with Marvel, and it's said like 9 times and I have no idea why. Coattail riding maybe? But it doesn't matter because it's time to head to Costa Rica where Jurassic Park was filmed, I'm pretty sure. A helicopter is flying towards a cave system as we phase through the ground from the waterfall. Now there's bats everywhere. Vampire bats. The helicopter lands and we meet the doctor himself. Getting out with 2 crutches, he appears to have difficulty walking, but is there to set up a trap in front of the mouth of the cave. As the workers get dangerously close to spinning helicopter blades, the trap is set. The Morbster then cuts his hand, attracting the vampire bat's attention. So he mentions later how these things can take out animals like hundreds of times their size, but then they don't eat Morbs alive, and I have no idea why. I guess just the rule of cool. Heading over to Greece 20 years prior, young Morbs watches another kid be brought in. I guess I can call him Lucian, or Lucian. I mean, it really just depends. I'm gonna call him Lucian. Actually, I'm not gonna call him any of that because Morbius is pretty much gonna call the kid Milo, and that's good enough for me. So they discuss kind of their blood disorder. They're missing a specific gene required for anticoagulation so that their blood needs to be filtered 3 times a day. Otherwise, they drop from a stroke or heart attack, which totally sucks. We get some jump around about how they're friends before for some reason there's kids outside the window calling them freaks just because they're sick. Don't worry, one of those kids will take a crutch in the face later. As Milo sits there though, he sort of like slumps over because his machine stops, and Morbius is able to fix it with a spring, which attracts the attention of Dr. Nicholas, who said, "Oh my god, due to your Morbin abilities, you fixed this," which took scientists years to develop. Okay, so I wrote this like a week and a half ago and I've completely forgotten what I've written. I do not remember writing this. Anyways, so I just want to say, hold on. I mean, I get that he fixed it, but it seems like an electrical issue of something disconnecting, not an entire redesign of a Blood Cleaner 9000. But it doesn't matter because the doctor is sending Morbius to the gifted kids school in New York. Morbius then leaves Milo a note that then somehow blows out the window, and as he goes to get it, the kids from earlier start messing with him as Milo then cracks a kid across the face, raw WWF style, with his crutch, which is pretty brutal. So now we kind of jump ahead to the most Jared Leto thing possible. Like, he's not even acting, this is just Jared Leto. He looks very displeased to be given the Nobel Prize, which they call it the Nobel Prize in the movie, which made me cringe a little. Not sure how that made it past testing, but he's receiving the award because of his invention of artificial blood, which he considers to be just a failure. If you didn't know, Jared is a bit of a diva apparently. I don't know, never met the dude myself, but it's just what I hear. So I'll be dunking on Jared Leto probably throughout this entire thing. So if you're like his #1 Leto fan, this might not be a good video for you. Back in New York, we learn that Jared Bear here dissed the king of Sweden and all of his subjects as he talks to a child. Dr. Bancroft arrives to scold him, as one does. Dr. Bancroft's pretty upsetty spaghetti at him for snubbing the Nobel Prize, not Nobel Prize. Jesus. Anyhow, I mean, one reshoot. Come on now. And the irony isn't lost on me that I'm literally starting to sound like everybody else who says that I pronounce Cadu wrong in Resident Evil Village. But she brings up how Dr. Morbius is mixing bat DNA with human DNA, which, wait, you know what? I think I've seen this one before. Yeah, it doesn't turn out too good. Morbius tells her she should ignore it due to plausible deniability because he will be dropping soon anyhow. He then pulls out a bat organ as as a vampire bat has developed a way to actually survive on only blood. So if he can isolate the gene, he can inject it into his own body and produce the same anticoagulants, freeing him of his disease. Sound thinking, but many issues would obviously need to be overcome, like what if you accidentally add in extra genes with similar genetic coding as with the gene that produces the anticoagulants? That's actually kind of one of the issues with CRISPR that we are currently attempting to overcome now. How do we target a specific sequence if further down the DNA chain that you go, there's another functional gene with a similar makeup that's also targeted? Well, old Morbster here is going to figure that out firsthand, and it doesn't really work too well. So we get some information on how what he's doing is definitely not unethical at all, as viruses insinuate their genetic coding into our DNA all the time, which is actually true. 8% of our coding are actually ancient viruses. But I would hazard a guess as to say adding in other animals' genetic codings, maybe not a good idea. But hey, I'm just a biologist, what do I know? Although I do agree the boundaries do have to be pushed for breakthroughs to be made. So he injects a mouse with his gene sequence and it drops. Test 117 did not go very well, but now a nurse arrives to tell him that Anna is about to drop due to a stroke, so they put her in a coma. Not really sure how that helps blood clots actually. I mean, I guess it would calm your rapid heartbeat and hopefully not break apart any more blood clots. So basically less circulatory stress, I would suppose. But as Dr. Bancroft turns around, Mouse 117 is reporting for duty. Dr. Morbius realizes that he needs money, so he goes to the only place he knows where he can get his testing funded: Milo's house. I have no idea why Milo is so rich. I'm guessing something like his parents are rich. You know, it's never really explained in the movie, probably in the comics though it is. So Milo and Morb go for a walk while discussing his findings. They stop at a park and he lays out what he needs: international waters, large ship, medical equipment. Milo's able to provide all this for him. That's what moves this movie along: money. Now the testing commences. The sequence is then added into the DNA of Morbius' blood as the genetic sequence is forever altered. Dr. Bancroft hooks up electrodes and gives him a spinal tap. Oh god. But Dr. Morbius also looks ultra frail. After the injection, he has a mild seizure, and as goon number 1 goes to randomly talk to Bancroft, they have this like hostile interaction for some reason. Not really sure why, as then they check Morbius' chair to see that he's gone. They then enter the room and find that he's in the Spider-Man universe and hanging from the ceiling. Goon number 1 calls on the goon squad and he's attacked and has his neck opened up for some fresh air. It's officially Morbin time. Bancroft attempts to talk to Morbius, but yeah, you know, I don't think he's in the right frame of mind right now. An alarm then goes off as he jumps around the room freaking out as Bancroft then gets knocked unconscious. This upsets Mr. Morbs as he hunts down every man in there, exsanguinating them with the greatest of ease. After going on a bloodbender, Morbius then comes back too as his body changes back into the real monster known as Jared Leto. And now he's Spider-Man ripped too. He goes to check on Bancroft as she's still alive. Just, you know, if you're knocked out for this long, the threat of brain damage is very real. Morbius watches what he did on cameras, then wipes the footage, calls it a mayday, and then jumps off the boat into the water. The boat is then towed in as detectives have arrived. These guys are not even remotely important, I'm going to be real. They really just kind of serve as exposition central. As Milo watches the boat that Morbius was on being towed in, he assumes that he's done so. Morbius goes to the hospital where Bancroft is and then checks her chart, seeing that she's probably going to be okay. But as Morbius enters his own lab, his ailments immediately begin coming back. So he heads to the fruit punch cooler and gets some of that fake blood that he created a while back. Now he begins testing to see how long he has. So I wonder if like cow blood would work in all honesty, maybe even pig blood, but artificial blood gives him about 6 hours to survive, but it's waning. Also, due to the other genes that were grafted onto Morbius's coding, he now has echolocation, which makes his ears look just like eye bleachable, but he's able to control it and literally catch a ball with his eyes closed. So now Morbius tries to quit the red stuff and traps himself in a room to see what the effects are. While he does this, Milo comes in the lab to say hey, and as he enters, he sees some of the injections, then finds Morbius withdrawing from the blood. Milo goes and grabs blood for him as Morbius drinks it, but then in Jared fashion, he starts throwing a temper tantrum. So Milo sees this, right? Just watched a man drink artificial blood and have this seizure like freak out and is like, hey bro, give me that cure too. It definitely seems to be like in its first stages. So rather than telling Milo that it's actually horrible and the reason that it's horrible, he just vaguely says stuff about bodying the guards and blood and being edgy, which predictably upsets Milo because he wants a cure. Bro, this looks nothing like a cure. I guess because Morbius is up and walking, Milo's a little jealous, but Morbius then yells at Milo with his face morbing with every yell. He then yells for Milo as Milo like literally leaves. He's doing what he asked. I don't really understand why he did this, but it makes zero sense. So as the dynamic duo shows up to question Bancroft, she says that she has no memory of any of this. They question her about Morbius and then leave. Later that night, as one of the nurses is in the creepiest hallways I've ever seen. I mean, really, look at this. She sees someone down the hallway jump onto the roof and she keeps just sitting there like, hello? Like, no way, bro. So she runs to the light switch before getting grabbed by Graveyard Smash Hand and then bitten. The next morning, Morbius wakes up and uses his echolocation to hear what's going on. He finds that one of the nurses he knows is drained of her blood at the end of the hallway, which alarms him as he doesn't even remember doing that. He grabs some blood Bud decides that it's probably time to throw deuces. However, the gruesome twosome are out in front waiting for him. So they chat him up. Oh, your artificial blood helped me. Roll Tide. But with Morbius's super special hearing, he gets a hold of their earpiece broadcast and they're being told to shut the building down, which then causes him to flee after punching one of the detectives. He ends up bullet dodging up the stairs and gets up there in like 3 seconds, and as he runs, he ditches the bag, which here's what I don't get. So he almost gets blown off the roof, like hard. I just don't understand. I suppose if he's like super light, like the Bat, but I don't know, man. But the other officer is able to make it up there in just record time, which someone's gonna comment and will tell me like he's a superhero or something, because dude, that was like 12 stories. Morbius had way more of a head start. It doesn't make any sense. So anyways, this basically puts him in jail now. In the interrogation room, the agents accuse him of offing the nurse from earlier. Morbius tells the agents that he needs the artificial blood as they wouldn't like him when he's hungry. Sounds like my wife. But now Milo appears to meet with Morbs. They discuss how Morbius is basically screwed and how he blacked out when he attacked the nurse. Milo tries to tell him that he doesn't belong in there, that he wouldn't do that, and then leaves him some blood. Then as Milo walks out, well, look at that miraculous recovery. Morbius finds he left his cane behind, basically confirming that Milo actually got frisky with that nurse. So Morbius takes the blood and then breaks out to go chase down his friend. So the cops like attempt to chase him down, which is hilarious. I mean, are you seeing this? It's like, yo, no, he's getting away. Like, bro, you aren't gonna catch him. So in broad nightlight, Milo then bites a dude selling newspapers, very smart. Then Morbius confronts Milo using his super hearing to track him down. Milo tries to tell him that he ended the nurse because he blacked out and couldn't control it. So this starts a lover's quarrel between the two in the subway system. They discuss how they have evolved as the cops now show up to arrest literal vampires. Milo then takes everyone out and dances. And as Milo yells after Morbius, a subway train shows up. Okay, so here's the thing. Remember how fast Milo can move? Well, in comparison with the train, he's actually not moving that quickly. But Morbius is able to ride the wind currents in front of the train? I don't know anymore. So the agents are now angry at Morbius for taking out the cops as Milo stands outside of Bancroft's apartment like a total weirdo. The agents decide Bancroft is in on it and begin tailing her. But she's able to get on a bus, which just so happens to contain Morbius. Like, what are the chances of that working out? I mean, I get that he was probably tailing her too, but bruh, like, no. They then do the smart thing and go to the coffee shop to discuss how Morbius is basically screwed with the artificial blood. It just so happens two counterfeiters show up with $100 bills and try to get the cashier to take the money, which she doesn't want to, then all of a sudden she does. Really gave it her all, didn't she? Anyhow, so this attracts the attention of Morbius because of course it does. Morbius then sends Bancroft back to the lab to grab stuff while he follows the goon squad and also randomly finds blood in a paramedic's bag. Why would a paramedic leave their bag of blood outside of the building that they need to go into to probably help somebody? It's beyond me. I mean, I did third riders and those things were pretty much strapped to your sides. And I'm pretty sure the blood is just always actually in the ambulance. You don't take it with you. I could be wrong though. Entering the lab in what appears to be an abandoned shopping mall, he comes in and tells everyone he needs their lab before breaking the guy in charge's hand, which sends the others running. And here we go with this next part. I guess it was like an Easter egg, I'm not sure. He calls himself Venom. Why? Well, who knows? That's the fun. I'm sure that means something to someone. Morbius now uses his Morbin skills to morb the room. Getting tired of that joke yet? Me too. And here's where the movie just gets awkward, right? So we see Doctor Who now is pretty pumped about his new body. Well, he's dancing around with his shirt off, making faces in the mirror. How awkward do you think this was to film? I mean, this movie was probably like 197% CGI, which this part in particular was big cringe to me. But his whole montage was just to go to the bar. He then meets a girl there and hits on her with his new persona, but some random dude tells him that her drinks are spoken for. It's like not her boyfriend. It appears to just be a random dude, but she treats him like she knows him. She's like, oh, you jerk. Like, do you know him or not? As him and his buddies leave for the night, Milo needs his manwich time and then attacks all three of them. Back in the lab, Milo is waiting for Bancroft. He wants to know where Morbius is and he can't seem to find him anywhere. He hears Bancroft's heartbeat and figures out that she's lying to him, but elects not to eat her neck meat and grumpily leaves by pulling down the police tape, which is pretty hilarious. So the cops now search Bancroft's apartment. Now I have to hit you with a question. Have you ever walked into someone's house that you don't know, shuffled the litter box of a cat, and because it doesn't immediately come running, you assume it's gone? Cats don't come to the shaking of a litter box. They come to the shaking of like treat bags. What even is this? Like, does this guy know cats? Does this movie know cats? Does this movie know human interactions? I don't think so. Back at the super secret lab, Bancroft almost gets straight up eaten, which causes Morbius to go to the roof. Bancroft comes up and talks to him, blah, blah, blah. They kiss, because, you know, you need that to happen, and Milo watches voyeur style from the train bridge. The agents now go and check the bar parking lot where the three guys were attacked and realize there's another vampire in town. The media urges people to stay in their homes after sundown, which they base this on nothing, because these aren't even real vampires. That's just the beauty of media sometimes. But as Dr. Nicholas sees the broadcast, he goes to confront Milo as, yep, that's definitely him. Milo at this point has a bit of an ego about this. He gets angry at Dr. Nicholas, so they have a spat over that, and it is hilarious listening to Milo be angry as he sounds like a huge nerd arguing over like which World of Warcraft faction is the most Chad-like. Alliance Paladins, by the way, but as Dr. Nicholas says for the Horde, this spurs Milo to slice open his stomach and have a freak out. Pretty sure that's what happened. That's what I recollect. Back at the lab, Morbius designs a way to basically take out himself. Inject him with something that will basically cause too much of a buildup of ferrite in his bloodstream, which will send him into organ failure shortly after, but he's also going to take Milo out as well. Just then, Nicholas calls Morbius, saying that he went to go see Milo and that he needs help. He finds him bleeding out on the ground, which for some reason doesn't activate his Dracula powers like it did with the drop of blood that Bancroft had, but using his hearing, Morbius can hear Milo telling Bancroft to call out for Morbius. He then sort of like stabs or something, like Milo stabs Bancroft. Following his waypoint, he's able to fly over the building and come down the location that she's at. He kisses her and gets a drop of blood in her mouth, which, gross. She drinks it and then she passes out from blood loss, so Morbius does the good thing and then bites her to help remove the last of her blood. What a guy. Now a fight ensues between Milo and Morbius. Honestly, Morbius was getting rocked during this whole thing. Should have gone for the werewolf route, I guess, but their fight leads them to under like the city. Like, what is this area? But this causes Morbius to let out a yell as he falls down and his hands send out a resonating wave. This activates the almonds of the nearby bats, which now are under Morbius's control. Okay, sure, why not? Here we get the next awkward scene, which must have been hilarious. As Milo jumps to try to stab Morbius, he uses the bats to hold Milo down. And for some reason, Morbius can control these bats, but not Milo. Morbius is able to get Milo and then stab him with the ferrite overload, causing his organs to begin shutting down. All because they couldn't have just even tried drinking pig blood. Classic. I mean, Milo could have afforded a farm, I'm just saying. But Morbius now exits a hole in the ground in a cloud of bats and then heads into the sky as Bancroft also wakes up having become a vampire. And holy lord, what a stupid ride that was. We get some post-credit stuff because everyone wants to be Marvel right now or in association with Marvel as a tear in the sky opens up. Look, I'm not the most up-to-date guy, but there's this other guy from another universe appearing in a cell, the Vulture as he's known. Then we get another one where Toomes is then set free and he approaches Morbius to make the Sinister Six. Of course, Morbius is supposed to be the anti-hero, but he sort of just acts like a quasi-hero. I don't know. The personality didn't really match up. So first things first, I would like to tell you, don't go and inject yourself with animal DNA into your body because A, you're likely to just catch some sort of bloodborne illness, and B, you would not inherit the powers of said animal. Which, speaking of bloodborne illnesses, Dr. Morbius clearly has one, which is the whole premise. I know, it took me a while to put together those pieces, but here we are. So what sort of illness does he have? Well, based on the context clues that we were given, there is an issue with the actual genetic coding. This results in pain in the legs and the rest of the body, hindered movement likely due to nervous tissue damage and problems with motor neurons, and the constant threat of a heart attack or stroke as seen with the little girl in Dr. Morbius's lab, who then ends up having almost a stroke before being placed in a medically induced coma. Is there a modern disease that we know of that can relate to this? And the answer is yes, which is horrible, but it is what it is. Life can be a nightmare sometimes. There can arise a mutation within the F5 gene of us that can result in blood clot issues. Known as factor V Leiden thrombophilia, or Leiden, it really doesn't matter, the main result of this genetic issue would cause blood clots to begin forming within the legs of a person, but the reality is it can form all over the body. The reason the legs are typically the area where this would happen more regularly is because as the heart pushes blood through the body, it will enter the legs on the downhill via the arteries, so high pressure. Then on the way back up, it enters the veins, which is a much lower pressure. It's sort of a design flaw if you actually think about it, but because of the thrombocytes and how they cannot be deactivated normally by the activated protein C or APC, this can lead to blood clots in this more slow moving blood. Now, even without genetic diseases, those with sedentary lifestyles who are overweight or just aging can have a propensity towards developing something known as DVT or deep vein thrombosis. Basically, it's just blood clots in your veins of your leg. You can help mitigate these issues by drinking nature's blood thinner known as water and staying hydrated and making sure to get up and walk around when you can, as well as exercise. With this disease though, only roughly about 10% of people will actually develop blood clot disorders associated with mutation, but likely the children in the group home with Dr. Morbius would have other mutations associated with the clotting factors that would lead them to have major issues with their blood, but the main gene mutation would likely be the F5. So what exactly are they doing to address this issue, and why does this leave them in the state that it does? Well, blood clots aren't just mysterious things that never have any signs or symptoms. People will regularly report pain around the area where a blood clot is, as it puts internal pressure on the circulatory system, as well as deprives the surrounding tissue of oxygen, which can lead to something like neuropathy in that area, causing pain. Now, there's a caveat to this. Blood clots are not always felt. Sometimes times you'll just throw a clot that you never even knew you had. But this is not only just as children, but with adults too. Their legs are not as functional as one would expect, and the contributing factor to this would be basically multiple blood clots within the legs, not so much necrosing the tissue, but stopping nerves from receiving the oxygen that they need, likely making them oxygen deprived, as well as the muscle tissue, because that's going to be experiencing the same thing. And that means now they cannot contract appropriately, resulting in the reliance of crutches. Whereas in the arms, they do not suffer the same issue, so the muscle and nervous tissue is more on par with what we would expect someone without this genetic issue to have. Ultimately, this makes them quite reliant on filtering out their blood 3 times a day, as without it, blood clots would build up within their body. So the machine is running the blood through, having the liquid blood pass, while capturing any large clots and removing them from the body. Obviously, this would have another issue which you may not really think of. The fact is, it really does take a lot for our bodies to build blood. Iron deficiencies would likely be quite common as blood cells get caught up in the machine and taken out, as to defeat the clotting issue, which would require the body to produce more hemoglobin on a near constant basis, which it already does to a degree, but it would basically become overworked because it's working at this increased rate, which in turn would put more stress on the body than normal and bones for this production. Think about giving blood like almost every day, but not so much that after 4 days you just drop. Just enough to be noticeable to you that you lost blood. You would constantly be run down. The other side is the creation of thrombocytes constantly being taken out as well, which would almost lead to you probably entering a hemophiliac status, as you would have less than normal amounts to stop you from clotting when needed, as it's always being used in problematic clotting, and you're probably also on blood thinners as well. Basically, you're constantly just drained by this disease, which in turn would have long-standing issues for the body and likely decrease your life expectancy, which is exactly why Dr. Morbius went with the artificial blood as a potential cure. Make a blood substitute that would keep a person alive in the event they lost blood, but with likely the added benefit of anticoagulants for Dr. Morbius and Milo. The issue is, however, the body will do what the body always does and attempt to filter anything out that's not supposed to be there, which would mean that over time, the blood would become less and less capable, which means that they would need to be added, or more would need to be added to them. This would say to Dr. Morbius that the experiment was a failure, despite it definitely increasing their lifespan and stopping the constant filtering of their blood. With our understanding of this disease, you can start to see, yeah, I think I would probably want to cure this thing too. Nothing like getting needles in your arms on an almost constant basis. And what do you do when you need to sleep? Probably wake up in the middle of the night and have your blood filtered. All in all, not a great way to live. So this would spur Dr. Morbius on in an attempt to find a cure for this genetic disease, which is where we get into something a little bit ridiculous. Now, if you don't actually have this disease, congratulations, you do have a normal clotting factor. And if you have a normal clotting factor, that means you also possess a normal gene for F5, which in turn means that you have that template. So ask yourself, if you were the Morbster, would you splice in random bat genetic coding due to its anticoagulating properties, or would you splice in a functional human gene sequence? If you said the former over the latter, then Godspeed with the pseudo-vampirism. But yes, why would he not take a human genome sequence? We literally have the knowledge now of where the mutation is. Now, I know you may be inclined to say, but Roanoke, how do you know in this universe that they even know about the F5 gene? Well, considering Dr. Morbius quite literally took out a piece of his own coding in order to place in the bat coding, I would have to assume that's where the genetic sequence is. And just by that, then clearly he could conduct the test to find the faulty gene on himself and find it within others. And then the counter is, what if that's not actually the faulty gene? Then how would he find the correct gene sequence in the bat? You see, it's things like that. When I was watching, I was just scratching my head. Why not just implant a sequence to correct the issue rather than go with the bat theory? It's like if you have a house and you buy the wrong door, you're like, oh crap, let me tear down the house and build the house correctly to match the door rather than just removing the door and putting in the door you like. Rule of cool strikes again. So now moving on to the bats before getting to the actual physiology of Dr. Morbius, why would he choose bats in the first place, I can hear you asking? Well, bats are kind of an interesting animal anyhow for several reasons, several annoying reasons if you stop to think about it, which is going to have to result in a side tangent to learn more about bats for a moment. This has nothing to do with Dr. Morbius, by the way. I just want to tell you about the bat immune system. You ever notice how a ton of viruses come from bats? Well, if you didn't, then now you do. And regularly, if this specific virus jumps to humans, you know how that goes. Or if an experiment takes place with the viruses being used on bats and then that gets out, that's also pretty bad. But the reason bats don't have as many issues is because it comes down to the actual bat's tolerance for viral infections and ability to address them. In its most basic form, bats' inflammation in response to a virus is lower and also runs at a constant low level, with low-level responses switched on should a virus arise. In humans, we usually have a larger inflammatory response, and our innate, while looking for invaders, isn't primed in the same way. This has allowed for bats to regularly live with things like SARS, Ebola, and even even rabies. In fact, if we could graft anything onto our bodies that would be nice, the best thing I think to do would be to put the immune system functions of bats into our bodies, which would make us more adept at dealing with viruses and also decrease our aging. Well, aging speed. Bats are known to, despite being a smaller animal, which typically leads to a shorter lifespan, live 10 times longer than mice, which are double their size. Anyhow, apart from that zoonotic discussion, just know this: bats have a lot of desirable genetics within their bodies that if someday we could harness would be quite beneficial for humanity as a whole, which may have been what Dr. Morbius was going for overall, but the issue would arise. Clearly, he didn't just implant one gene, but several genes that had morphological impacts as well. Now, there was one specific gene that Dr. Morbius was actually going for that was successful in implanting into his own coating, which resulted in his disease all but evaporating from his meat suit. The sequence coded for something known as Draculin, or Draculin, or however you want to pronounce it. I know, right? It's literally Draculin. We'll go with Draculin. This glycoprotein is found specifically in vampire bat saliva. When it bites into an animal, this is released into the bloodstream of that animal to prevent it from clotting for a short time, allowing the vampire to drink any blood that comes out. Despite popular belief, they don't just stay attached in drinking, they'll actually just drink what dribbles out. This enzyme, known as desmodoplasm, has many medical applications as well, and upon being injected into the brains of mice who have experienced a stroke, there's like a window where you can destroy the blood clot, which with this particular enzyme increased it from about 3 to 9 hours. The goal is to dissolve the clot and lower the risk of bleeding in the brain. And if you think that's weird, we actually have something known as a clot buster now that can be administered, I believe, by paramedics. And if I remember correctly, it is derived from copperhead venom. But, so as you can see this would have all been of great interest. So rather than having the APC take over and naturally break apart the blood clots that would arise within the body, Draculin could have been used to forcibly break them up. And if the body naturally produced it in its own coating, then at all times, blood clots would be destroyed. Now, this sounds great in theory until you remember that people on blood thinners currently, or those that have issues forming blood clots, become hemophiliacs and can literally bleed out if cut in a way that should normally just seal up. So then the idea would have to have been, how do you control it? Where should the gene actually go so that when blood clots arise, you can activate it in a way that would not express all the time and make you bleed out from, say, a paper cut, but that you could also use in times of stress? Well, it's dependent on when the stress is really. So we see with Dr. Morbius, he will change into basically this vampire form whenever he becomes hungry enough. That is the uncontrollable variable that we have seen in him. But there's also times when he can control it at will in order to fly or fight Milo. When he is turned, however, the process remains until he decides that he basically needs to come down. This would say to me that it's likely based on a stress response, and with that stress response, we would need to look at a hormone called cortisol. Cortisol can be great in some ways, but usually horrible in most ways. Being that it's a stress hormone, it puts your body on high alert and is associated with anxiety and brain chemistry alteration to a degree if not controlled. Chronic stress is known to actually disrupt synapse regulation, resulting in a loss of social ability and avoidance of others. Cortisol itself is released from the adrenal glands of the body, and now this will be important because it will explain why there are two versions of Dr. Morbius, the one that's in control and the one that's just basically an animal feeding. The stress response that he has means that at will, he could have his body release the Draculin into his body by having that area specifically on his adrenal glands altered in a way concerning the genetic coding implantation. By basically amping himself up, it would serve as a clot buster in his body with potentially just low levels being released anyhow. But by calming himself, the Draculin levels would fall, ensuring that he doesn't bleed out if injured. Now, this all sounds well and good, but an issue arose. Cross-contamination. Well, sort of anyhow. It's apparent that it was not only the gene containing the glycoprotein Draculin that was implanted onto his DNA, but also likely several other genes that would interestingly cause a gene expression problem during times of stress and at will. Now, the Draculin appears to have expressed correctly in the adrenal areas, but here's where something conflicting happens. When Dr. Morbius gets hungry enough for food, his disease will return to him. Seeing as this is the case, when you enter starvation mode, your body will release more cortisol, activating the adrenal glands as it's time to eat, and really you need to go find something. So in theory, it should release more Draculin, but as blood clots build up in the body due to this disease taking place once more, this means that something else is happening, which now we see the hunger hormone come into play along with gene expression of the extra coating from the bat. The only thing that would make sense to me is that when he has officially become hungry enough for food, there must be something within the blood he consumes that helps him produce Draculin. So when he has gone long enough without artificial or real blood, his ability to produce Draculin wanes considerably, allowing his disease to return. But ghrelin has another purpose, seeing as it's the hunger hormone. It would appear that ghrelin, upon being released, letting him know that he's hungry, would go to the brain as its normal pathway of being secreted by the stomach, activating the vagus nerve, and then cross crossing the blood-brain barrier to get to the hypothalamus to let the brain know that the body is hungry and that it's time to eat. So this is where the issues arose for Dr. Morbius. It would appear to me that the other genes associated with the bat had worked their way into the implantation process, causing several changes for Morbius. These genes can either be activated by ghrelin, which is hunger, which in turn causes him to forcibly turn into the creature where he has less control as he's driven by this hunger, or he can control the transformation process by hyping himself up by activating the adrenal glands to a degree which will release the adrenaline into his body, increasing Draculin levels as well. With adrenaline increasing, this would also have an impact on the hypothalamus, causing the same changes that we see. Now, the endocrine system is fairly complicated, but I believe at its core, this is how it would work concerning his transformation process. Likely there are other hormones he would be reliant on, but by accidentally allowing other bat genetic sequences into his body, this in turn would cause his body to change overall. So speaking of that, let's take a look at those changes real quick and see where they hail from. First, we see the musculature overall changes upon his genetic alteration. While being quite scrawny beforehand, after his growth in muscle is noted, this would mean that the muscle strands themselves have grown in thickness. This would be necessary, but it's likely coming from genes associated with muscle growth in bats, as considering they must fly despite them being quite small, they're still relatively muscular creatures, more so upon the torso as this area is critical to flight. It's a literal peck fly the whole time for them. That's why they call it a peck fly. Next we see, not always, but upon his change, the actual skeletal structures change somewhat in his face, with the cheeks increasing in size and jutting more outwards, and the teeth growing considerably. Now I think we all know once this happens, this would just not go away in a matter of seconds, as it would require bodily processes to take over and erode away the cheekbones via osteoclasts and forming them via osteoblasts. The teeth are also once again rule of cool, but clearly hail from the vampire bat's genetic sequence concerning his own teeth. Expression of this gene would require all new teeth, and then for human teeth to come back afterwards is just a little hilarious. The nose changes, however, to mimic that of a vampire bat, which likely also means that Dr. Morbius is able to sense via specialized systems in this area using infrared to hone in on warm-blooded vertebrates. And that might be why he is able to not just use echolocation to see the city around him and the waypoint to find Dr. Bancroft, but also his nose. The eyes will change to a bright red, indicating that potentially the blood vessels in the eyes and likely all over the body are dilating to a degree, but also because of the bat genes, they take on this sort of hue as blood flows through them. And when they're coming back to human form, the vessels will likely shrink back down, revealing the natural eye color once again. The hands do have some changes, as the nails can grow several inches in length and be used for offensive purposes such as slashing and stabbing, which is great if you're trying to get to someone's blood. And finally, we get to the ears. Good God, these things look gross. I don't know, man, they just sort of like freak me out. But anyway, so obviously Dr. Morbius is able to search his surroundings using this echolocation, much like a real bat, but there is a common misbelief that bats actually have poor eyesight. Vampire bats use a combination of echolocation and their eyesight to hunt, as well as the infrared sensors in their nose, which I guess is great for Jared. Otherwise, after that injection, he might not be able to see anymore when he turns. But this echolocation is allowed by the bat's own genes for him to pick up noise by bouncing sound he creates off of objects and listening to that sound, which I do have to say, I seriously doubt his hearing is so good that he can hear Bancroft whispering miles away in a city. There's so much noise, it would probably be debilitating in real life if he acquired this ability, as the noise would be too much for his brain to process. I'm just throwing that out there for a moment. But I do want to talk about his perception of time for a moment. Now, every animal has a different perception of the world around them. Take flies, for instance. Have you ever tried to smack one? Well, it always seems like at the last moment that they fly away. And this is because their perception of the world around them is much faster than a human's. To them, it looks like we are slowly moving towards them with our hand, so they take off. To us, it seems so much faster. It's because our processing of incoming information from our senses is slower. So if you ever want to catch a fly, go slow. It'll look like you aren't even moving it. Sort of like how you don't really notice trees actually growing, because to us, our perception is so much faster than their growth, but they're definitely growing. With bats, they perceive much faster than humans as well. Because of this, when Morbius enters Morbin time, his perception of the world around him matches that of a bat, or at least close to it, making others seem slower and allowing him to react, sort of like how he's able to dodge lead fairly regularly. The next to last trait that you can see Morbius do that somehow just exists, and I'm going to be honest with you here, is only because he's supposed to be the anti-hero superhero thing, is his flight. Now, vampire bats are incredibly light and agile flyers. It's because of their size that they're able to do this. Humans are not that light. We are actually relatively heavy. It is implied that because of the bat coating, he can feel air currents due to his echolocation and then ride them because he's super light. I mean, make of that what you will. Sometimes superhero stuff just has to be supernatural. And finally, what's the deal with the need for blood? Now, blood is low in nutrients, funnily enough, and high in protein, which means means changes to Dr. Morbius's kidneys would also need to be done so that he could filter his own blood in the first place. But this could help him with the ability to grow muscle quickly like he does upon feeding on others on the ship. But the issue is, the vampire bats actually possess the gut flora necessary for the blood to be properly broken down and turned into nutrients that their body can then use. As far as I know, Dr. Morbius does not possess this unless he intentionally infected himself with the flora prior to his transformation, and the human gut microbiome would not support this diet. However, once this was done, this would push him towards getting blood to be broken down properly to allow him to survive. But what's hilarious is, he doesn't need human blood all the time. The artificial blood works somewhat, but decreases in effectiveness as it's clearly lacking something that the real thing has. But again, why not start a cow farm, or a pig farm, or an animal farm, and then just have the blood shipped to you to drink? Like I said, Milo is friggin' rich. He probably already has farms. If vampire bats can survive on warm-blooded animals and don't have to eat each other to survive, then so too could Morbius, having been altered by bat genes and possessing the same gut microbiome. To sum this thing up, he morbed too hard and lost the edge.